The retired Admiral dropped his champagne glass so hard it shattered across the ballroom floor. That's how the night began. Crystal exploded beside polished dress shoes, while conversations stopped mid-sentence all around us. A pianist near the stage missed 3 notes in a row before giving up completely. I stood frozen beside the buffet table, holding a plate I suddenly couldn't feel in my hands. The Admiral was staring directly at me. Not casually. Not politely. Like a man who had just seen somebody return from the dead. My father laughed awkwardly beside him, completely unaware of what was happening. "Careful there, Tom," he joked. "Didn't mean to scare you." But retired Admiral Thomas Walker never took his eyes off me. "Impossible," he whispered. His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. Then he said the sentence that changed the entire room. "That's the woman who extracted my entire unit from Syria." Silence swallowed the ballroom whole. You could hear ice settling inside whiskey glasses. Across the room, several retired officers slowly turned toward me with expressions I recognized immediately. Recognition. Shock. Memory. My younger sister Melissa looked between us in confusion, while her husband David lowered his drink halfway to the table. Dad blinked twice, then laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, now hold on," he said. "You've got the wrong person. Caroline here worked office contracts or something." I wanted to disappear. That was the worst part. Not embarrassment. Not fear. Exhaustion. 20 years of learning how to survive quietly had taught me one thing above all else. Attention is dangerous. Admiral Walker took one slow step toward me. Older now. Gray-haired. Still carrying the posture of command. But I recognized him instantly despite the years. Northern Syria. Dust storms. Black SUVs running without headlights. Radio static screaming through broken communications. Men trapped behind shifting front lines while Washington debated liability. He looked at me carefully, almost emotionally. "My God," he said softly, "you're alive." That sentence hit harder than the recognition itself. Because some part of me hadn't fully believed it either. The ballroom at the Coronado Bay Resort suddenly felt too warm, too crowded, too bright. I set my untouched plate onto a nearby table before my shaking hands dropped it too. My father stared between us now, confusion slowly hardening into irritation. "You two know each other?" Walker answered before I could. "She saved 31 Americans during the Raqqa evacuation." The room stayed silent. I closed my eyes briefly. Raqqa. I hadn't heard that city spoken aloud in years. Most people back home forgot Syria the second headlines moved on. Americans are good at forgetting distant wars once they stop interrupting dinner television. But some of us never left those places completely. "Admiral," I said quietly, "that was a long time ago." His expression changed slightly. Not pity. Something worse. Respect. "You carried one of my wounded operators across half a mile of open road under sniper fire." Dad laughed nervously again. Now I know there's some misunderstanding here. But nobody else was laughing anymore. Because military people understand tone. And Admiral Walker sounded like a man discussing the dead. I should explain something. My father loved military prestige. Loved it. Richard Hayes built a successful accounting firm in Richmond after Vietnam kept him stateside during the draft years. The fact he never served haunted him privately for decades, though he rarely admitted it directly. So instead he worshipped accomplishment. Officers. Decorated veterans. Successful businessmen. Men with stories impressive enough to repeat over steak dinners and golf outings, which made Melissa's husband perfect in his eyes. David trained Navy SEAL candidates in Coronado now after retiring from active duty, and Dad had spent the entire weekend introducing him like royalty. He trains Navy SEALs, he kept proudly telling people. Like somehow that achievement belonged to him too. Then somebody at our dinner table had jokingly asked the question, "What does your daughter even do?" And Dad, smiling into his bourbon glass, answered casually, "Honestly, Caroline never really settled into anything." That familiar little laugh afterward. The one designed to soften cruelty into humor. I'd heard it my entire adult life. She drifts around. Government contract work, mostly. Could never stay in one place long. Smart girl, just never found herself. The Admiral interrupted my thoughts gently. "May I sit with you?" I wanted to say no. Instead, I nodded once. We moved toward a quieter corner of the ballroom near wide windows overlooking San Diego Bay. Outside, sailboat lights moved softly against black water, while distant music drifted from another wedding downstairs. Walker lowered himself carefully into the chair across from me. "You disappeared after Aleppo," he said quietly. "I retired." "You vanished." "That too." His old commander eyes studied me carefully now. "You still having nightmares?" That question nearly took my breath away. Because only somebody who lived through it would ask that first. Not "how are you?" Not "where have you been?" Nightmares. I looked away toward the harbor lights. "Sometimes?" He nodded like he expected no other answer. Across the ballroom, Dad still watched us uneasily while guests whispered among themselves. Melissa approached cautiously after a minute. "Caroline," she said softly, "what's happening?" I forced a calm expression. "Nothing important." Walker almost smiled sadly at that. "Still protecting everybody else, I see." Melissa looked completely lost now. "You were in Syria." Before I could answer, Dad finally walked over carrying fresh drinks. "All right," he said firmly. "I think somebody better explain what's going on." Walker looked directly at him. "With respect, Richard, your daughter prevented one of the worst military disasters I ever witnessed." Dad scoffed automatically. "That's impossible." The Admiral's face hardened slightly. "No," he said quietly. "What was impossible is that she got us out alive." Silence again. Heavy this time. Melissa stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. David slowly approached too now, his training instincts clearly picking up tension. "You really worked extraction?" he asked carefully. I hated that word. Worked. Like trauma was employment. Like Syria was a resume item. "Something like that," I answered. Dad folded his arms defensively. "Well, if any of this is true, why the hell didn't you ever say something?" There it was. Not concern. Not curiosity. Accusation. I looked at him for a long moment before answering quietly. "Because every time I came home you only noticed what was wrong with me." His expression shifted immediately. But before he could respond, Walker spoke again. "Richard?" He paused carefully. "Do you have any idea what your daughter carried back from that war?" Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. Because suddenly the room had changed. People weren't admiring him anymore. They were looking at me. And for the first time in my life, my father realized the daughter he dismissed for years might have been fighting battles he never bothered trying to understand. Outside the ballroom windows, dark water rolled softly through San Diego Bay, while old memories began rising inside me like ghosts refusing to stay buried. And deep down I knew this night was only the beginning. I left the ballroom 15 minutes later without saying goodbye to anyone. Some exits become instinct after enough years around danger. You learn to recognize the moment a room turns emotionally unstable. Voices shift, eyes linger too long, questions start coming faster than answers. And suddenly breathing feels harder than it should. The night air outside the Coronado Bay Resort felt cold against my skin, despite the California warmth. I walked toward the marina with no real destination in mind, heels clicking softly against wooden docks while sailboats rocked gently in black water beside me. Behind the ballroom windows, life continued. Laughter. Music. Wine glasses raised beneath chandeliers. Meanwhile, my entire past had just cracked open in public like an old wound splitting under pressure. I leaned both hands against the railing near the far end of the dock and stared across the bay toward downtown San Diego, glowing in the distance. 20 years. 20 years of silent secrecy and carefully controlled distance. Gone in one evening. You always run toward water. I closed my eyes briefly. Admiral Walker. Of course. I'm not running. That's what everybody says while running. I almost smiled despite myself. He stepped beside me quietly, hands tucked inside the pockets of his blazer. Up close, age showed more clearly now. Deep lines around his eyes, gray at the temples, slight stiffness in the way he moved his left shoulder. Syria took pieces from everyone. Some wounds just showed slower. You shouldn't have said all that in there, I said softly. Walker stared out across the marina. I know. Then why did you... His answer came immediately. Because your father humiliated you. That surprised me enough to actually look at him. Walker sighed heavily. Caroline. I sat in command rooms watching politicians debate whether my men were worth the risk. His voice lowered slightly. I'm too old now to stay quiet while decent people get treated like they're disposable. The word hit harder than he intended. Disposable. That's exactly how many of us felt coming home. Useful overseas. Uncomfortable back here. A yacht horn echoed somewhere across the harbor. Walker glanced at me carefully. You really disappeared after Syria. I tried. You stopped answering everyone. I wasn't in good shape. That was the cleanest version of the truth. The real version looked uglier. Panic attacks in grocery stores. Sleeping with lights on. 3 failed relationships because I startled awake swinging at shadows. Changing jobs every year because sitting inside ordinary offices felt unbearable after watching entire cities collapse into violence. Walker nodded slowly like he understood anyway. You know, he said quietly, my wife used to ask about you. I frowned slightly. Why? She said nobody risks themselves that many times unless they're carrying something broken already. That sentence landed deep because it was probably true. The marina stayed quiet around us, except for ropes creaking against docks in the wind. Finally, Walker spoke again. Do they really not know? Number. Nothing. I gave a tired shrug. My family thinks I did administrative consulting. He stared at me in disbelief. You coordinated covert extractions through active combat zones. I also missed Christmas 6 years straight and got divorced twice. I looked back toward the ballroom windows. People tend to focus on what affects them personally. Walker fell silent after that. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. They don't rush to fill every empty space with noise. After a minute, he asked softly, Do you ever talk about Syria with anyone? Number. Therapist. Briefly. Friends. I laughed once under my breath. Most people stop calling after you cancel enough dinners. That seemed to genuinely pain him. You saved a lot of lives, and lost others. There it was. The real thing underneath everything else. Survivor's guilt. The permanent roommate nobody sees. Walker rubbed a hand slowly across his jaw. You remember Sergeant Miller? I stiffened immediately. Yes. His daughter just graduated nursing school. I looked away fast toward the water. Sergeant Ben Miller. 41 years old. Minnesota National Guard attached to Special Operations support during the Syria evacuation. Funny. Loved old country music. Carried photos of twin daughters inside his vest. Dead 37 feet away from me after mortar fire hit our convoy route outside Raqqa. Walker's voice softened. You blamed yourself for that. I changed the route. You changed it because the original road was compromised. He still died. The Admiral looked at me carefully. That's war. No, I answered quietly. That's leadership. We stood there silently afterward while cold wind moved through the marina. Eventually, footsteps approached behind us. Dad. Even before turning around, I knew by the rhythm alone. Richard Hayes always walked like a man late for a meeting. He stopped several feet away awkwardly. I figured you might be out here. Neither Walker nor I answered immediately. Dad looked uncomfortable standing on the dock in his expensive blazer and polished loafers, like somebody accidentally dropped him into another life entirely. Finally, he cleared his throat. Mind if I talk to my daughter? Walker glanced toward me. I nodded once. The Admiral squeezed my shoulder gently before walking back toward the resort alone. Dad watched him leave. Then exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, this has been one hell of an evening. I stayed quiet. He leaned beside me against the railing. You could have told us. There it was again. Not what happened to you. Not, are you okay? You could have told us. I stared at dark water moving beneath the dock. Would it have mattered? His face tightened. Of course it would have mattered. You sure about that? Dad rubbed his forehead tiredly. Caroline, don't do this. Do what? Turn this into an attack. I laughed softly at that. Because to him, honesty always sounded like attack. You spent years introducing Melissa like she was proof you succeeded as a father. My voice stayed calm. Then you introduced me like an apology. That's not fair. No, I finally looked directly at him, Tonight was the first time I've ever seen you curious about my life." He opened his mouth immediately, then stopped, because he knew I was right. Wind moved across the marina, carrying distant music from the ballroom. Dad stared down at the water for a long time before speaking again. "When you came home from overseas," his voice slowed carefully, "you changed." I almost smiled sadly. That was the understatement of the century. "You became cold," he continued quietly, "distant, angry all the time. I was traumatized." The word hit him visibly. Traumatized. Not dramatic. Not unstable. Traumatized. Dad swallowed hard. "I didn't know." "No," I agreed softly. "You didn't ask." Silence stretched painfully between us. Then very quietly he asked the question that should have come years earlier. "What happened to you over there?" I closed my eyes. And just like that, Syria came flooding back again. Dust. Gunfire. Smoke rolling through shattered streets. Children crying beneath concrete buildings with no roofs left. And 31 trapped Americans waiting in darkness while radio communications slowly died one by one. I opened my eyes toward the black California water. "A lot," I whispered. For the first time in my adult life, my father stood beside me without trying to correct, criticize, or compare me to someone else. And somehow that hurt worse than every insult combined. Syria smelled like burning plastic and diesel fuel. That's the first thing I remember now. Not politics. Not missions. Not patriotism. Smell. Funny what the brain saves after trauma. A cheap air freshener in a taxi can drag me backward 15 years before I even realize what's happening. Smoke from a roadside grill, hot engine oil, fireworks after dark. Suddenly I'm not in California anymore. I'm back inside a collapsing city, listening to distant gunfire echo between concrete buildings, while grown men try not to panic over broken radios. Dad stood beside me on the marina dock, waiting quietly. I think older people understand something younger generations often miss. When somebody finally begins telling the truth after years of silence, you don't interrupt them. "You remember when I disappeared in 2017, I asked softly. Dad nodded slowly. "You told everyone I was doing consulting work overseas." "That's what you said." "Because it was easier." Wind moved cold across the water while lights shimmered across San Diego Bay. I stared down at my hands resting against the railing. They attached me to a joint extraction program operating near the Syrian border. I paused briefly, mostly recovery operations, evacuations, asset relocation. Dad frowned slightly. "You mean military rescue missions?" "Sometimes." The truth was messier than that. Officially, half the work didn't exist. Unofficially, people died constantly. I closed my eyes briefly. The operation Walker mentioned wasn't supposed to happen. And suddenly I was there again. Northern Syria. October 2017. 3 American vehicles disabled outside Raqqa after local intelligence collapsed mid-operation. Enemy forces shifting faster than expected. Multiple teams trapped without secure extraction routes. Command hesitated. Too dangerous. Too politically sensitive. Too expensive. War always becomes accounting eventually. Walker's unit spent 14 hours pinned inside an abandoned textile warehouse, while drone surveillance failed repeatedly due to weather conditions and electronic interference. No reliable exit. No air support. No guarantees. Dad listened silently now, expression tightening more every minute. We had local contacts still operating smuggling corridors near the Turkish border. I continued quietly. Old civilian routes, some were still usable. "You organized the rescue." "I organized transportation." That sounded smaller. Safer. Less personal. But Dad looked at me carefully. "That Admiral said you carried wounded soldiers." I swallowed slowly. Because once memories start moving, they don't stop politely. One of Walker's operators took sniper fire crossing a street near the industrial district. Femoral artery damage. Losing blood fast. Vehicles couldn't reach him because the road was exposed. So I went myself. Not bravery. Necessity. People misunderstand that all the time. Most acts labeled heroic happen because somebody runs out of alternatives. "I got him into a transport van," I said softly. "That's all." Dad stared at me in disbelief. You make it sound ordinary. Nothing felt ordinary anymore after enough years around death. A ferry horn echoed across the harbor while music drifted faintly from the ballroom behind us. Finally, Dad asked quietly, "How many times were you over there?" I laughed once without humor. Too many. His face looked older under the dock lights now. Not physically. Emotionally. Like invisible pieces of his understanding were rearranging themselves painfully. "You were gone all the time," he murmured. "I know. You'd come home for holidays and barely speak to anybody." I looked out toward the black water. Because my nervous system was still overseas. That sentence seemed to genuinely confuse him. So I explained, "You don't come back from places like that overnight." I searched for words he might understand. "Your body keeps waiting for danger long after danger's gone." He stayed quiet. I continued anyway. Crowded restaurants felt unsafe. Loud noises triggered adrenaline. I couldn't sleep properly. My throat tightened slightly. Sometimes I'd wake up convinced somebody was breaking into the house. Dad rubbed one hand slowly across his mouth, and we thought he stopped himself. "What?" He looked ashamed suddenly. "We thought maybe you were drinking too much." That hurt less than it should have. Because honestly, plenty of operators did. Some still do. People numb pain however they can. "I know what you thought," I answered gently. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Then Dad asked the question buried beneath everything else. "Why didn't you trust us enough to tell us?" I stared at the water carefully before answering. Because every time I tried acting normal around the family, I failed. The words came easier now. Not because they stopped hurting. Because exhaustion finally outweighed fear. "You remember Melissa's Christmas party in 2018? Dad nodded slowly. "You snapped at Uncle Gary." He grabbed me from behind unexpectedly. I swallowed. I nearly broke his wrist before I realized where I was. Dad's eyes widened slightly. "I thought you were overreacting." "I was having flashbacks." Silence. Heavy silence. I didn't understand what was happening to me yet, I admitted quietly. I just knew I couldn't relax anymore. That was the ugliest truth about trauma. Sometimes you don't even recognize yourself. The ballroom doors opened behind us suddenly, and Melissa stepped outside carrying her shoes in one hand. "There you are." She approached slowly, clearly unsure whether she was interrupting something fragile. Dad straightened slightly beside me. Melissa looked between us cautiously. "Everything okay?" Neither of us answered immediately. Finally, Dad nodded once. "We're talking." Melissa almost smiled sadly at how strange that sounded coming from him. She leaned beside me against the railing. "You know, half the ballroom thinks you're CIA now." I laughed softly despite myself. "Wonderful." David's been cornered by retired Marines for an hour asking about Syria. That made me groan quietly. Attention spreads fast in military circles. Especially stories involving survival. Melissa studied me carefully in the marina light. "You really saved those men." I looked away immediately. Because that question always carried another one beneath it. "Who didn't you save?" "That operation went bad," I answered carefully. "But you got them out." "Most of them." Dad caught that instantly. "What do you mean most?" There it was. The part families never imagine when they romanticize service. Failure. Loss. The names you carry forever afterward. I closed my eyes briefly. Sergeant Miller died during the extraction. Melissa's face fell immediately. Dad looked physically stricken. "How?" "Mortar strike." The words still tasted metallic after all these years. "He had daughters," I added quietly, "twin girls." Nobody spoke. Somewhere inside the ballroom, people laughed loudly over wedding stories and old military jokes, while outside on the dock, 3 members of the same family stood facing the reality that war doesn't end just because somebody makes it home alive. Melissa finally touched my arm gently. "You carried all this by yourself." I almost answered automatically. That's what trained people do. Minimize. Deflect. Endure quietly. But tonight, honesty kept forcing its way loose. "Yes," I whispered. Dad looked down toward the dark water for a very long time. And when he finally spoke again, his voice sounded smaller somehow. "My God, Caroline. Not judgment. Not criticism. Just grief. Because for the first time, my father was beginning to understand that the daughter he called unstable had actually come home carrying ghosts too heavy for most people to survive gracefully. The following evening, Admiral Walker invited several guests to a private dinner overlooking the bay. I almost didn't go. Honestly, after the scene at the gala, disappearing back to Virginia sounded a whole lot easier than sitting through another room full of military stories and awkward attention. But Melissa knocked on my hotel door around 6 carrying 2 coffees and wearing the same expression she used to have when we were girls, trying to convince Dad not to cancel summer vacations after bad weeks at work. "Please come," she said softly. "People aren't talking about you like gossip anymore." "That's supposed to help." She smiled sadly. "They're talking about you with respect." That word still made me uncomfortable. Respect can become another kind of distance. Still I went. The dinner took place at a quiet seafood restaurant tucked along the marina in Coronado. Nothing flashy, dark wood walls, framed Navy photographs, old Frank Sinatra songs drifting softly through hidden speakers while sailboats rocked outside beneath yellow dock lights. The crowd skewed older. Retired officers. Military spouses. A few gray-haired veterans walking carefully with canes and old injuries. The kind of Americans who speak slower now because life already taught them what matters. Dad stayed unusually quiet during the drive over. No boasting. No forced jokes. Just silence. And honestly, that worried me more. Walker greeted us warmly near the entrance. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted again into something halfway between relief and disbelief. "You came." Melissa threatened emotional manipulation. That sounds effective. For the first time all weekend, I saw him genuinely smile. Inside dinner unfolded politely at first. Crab cakes. Wine. Stories about retirement communities and grandchildren and bad knees from military service decades earlier. Normal aging American conversations. The kind people earn after surviving enough life. I relaxed slightly after the first hour. Then Dad ruined it. Not intentionally. That almost made it worse. One of the retired colonels asked whether I still worked in government contracting. Before I could answer, Dad gave that familiar little laugh again. "You know, Caroline," he said casually, "she never stays anywhere very long." There it was. The old version of me. The unstable daughter. The difficult one. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Melissa closed her eyes briefly beside him like she already knew damage was coming. Dad kept talking unaware. "She's always been restless, smart as a whip, but..." He shrugged lightly. "Could never really settle into ordinary life." Silence spread slowly across the table. Not dramatic silence. Disappointed silence. Walker set his wine glass down carefully. "Richard," he said quietly with respect, "ordinary life stopped being an option for your daughter a long time ago." Dad blinked. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," Walker answered. "That's the problem." The table went still. Every older veteran there recognized tension instantly. Military people develop radar for emotional explosions because they spend years preventing them. Dad straightened slightly. "Well, I'm sorry if I embarrassed anyone." Walker's eyes hardened. "You embarrassed her. I wanted to stop this immediately. The last thing I needed was public defense. I'd spent years surviving without anybody protecting me emotionally. Suddenly receiving it now felt almost unbearable. Admiral." But Walker continued. "Do you know what your daughter did during the Raqqa extraction?" Dad's jaw tightened immediately. "We've already heard the story." "No," Walker said firmly. "You heard headlines, you didn't hear the truth." The restaurant had grown quieter around us now. Even nearby tables were beginning to notice. Walker looked directly at my father. My unit was trapped for 14 hours in a dead communication zone, while command debated whether recovering us was worth the political fallout. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Walker continued calmly. 3 rescue attempts failed before Caroline arrived. I stared down at my untouched food. "Please stop. Please." But older men who carried survivors' guilt rarely stop once truth starts moving. She crossed hostile checkpoints using civilian transport routes nobody else was willing to risk. Walker's voice roughened slightly. "And when one of my operators got hit..." He looked directly at Dad now. Your daughter carried him herself." The entire table stayed silent. Dad looked genuinely shaken. "She weighed maybe 130 pounds, Walker continued softly. "My operator weighed over 200 with gear." Melissa slowly covered her mouth with one hand. I could feel every eye turning toward me now. The same thing I'd spent 20 years avoiding. Recognition? Walker leaned back slightly. Most people at that point would have abandoned the wounded and saved whoever they still could. His eyes moved toward me briefly. Caroline refused. Dad looked at me differently now. Not proudly. Confused. Like the daughter sitting beside him no longer matched the version he'd spent years believing existed. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" And something inside me finally cracked. Not explosively. Not dramatically. Just enough for years of exhaustion to start spilling through. Because every time I came home, I said softly, "You acted like the problem was my personality." Dad's face fell immediately. Nobody interrupted. So I kept going. "You told people I was unstable." "Caroline." "You compared me to Melissa constantly." "I was worried about you." "No," I answered firmly. "You were embarrassed by me." The words landed like stones in water. Heavy. Final. Dad stared down at the tablecloth. I continued quietly now because anger had finally burned itself into sadness. "You saw panic attacks and called me difficult." My throat tightened painfully. "You saw insomnia and called me irresponsible. You saw trauma and decided I just couldn't adjust to adulthood." Melissa started crying silently beside me. I looked toward her immediately. "That's not your fault." But she shook her head. "Yes, it is." "Number?" "I let him do it," she whispered. "I let everybody think you were selfish because it was easier than asking why you changed." That hurt worse somehow. Because Melissa wasn't cruel. Just comfortable. And comfort makes people ignore pain sitting right beside them. Walker spoke quietly into the silence. "There are men alive today because Caroline chose not to leave them behind." Then another voice surprised me. An older Marine sitting farther down the table cleared his throat. My son was attached to support logistics during that operation. I looked up slowly. The man's eyes filled with emotion. He came home, his voice cracked, because of that extraction. The restaurant stayed completely silent now except for soft Sinatra music drifting through speakers overhead. Dad suddenly looked older than I'd ever seen him. Not physically. Spiritually. Like some terrible realization was finally settling into place. "You came home broken," he whispered toward me. I swallowed hard. "Yes, and I punished you for it." Nobody moved. Nobody rescued him from that truth. Because there are moments in life when pain finally deserves to be seen clearly. Dad rubbed trembling hands together slowly. "My God." I stared out toward the marina windows, where sailboat lights drifted across black water beyond the glass. And for the first time in my life, my father was finally seeing me not as a disappointment, but as a wounded human being who'd been drowning quietly right in front of him for years. After the dinner ended, I sat alone in the hotel parking garage for almost 40 minutes without starting the car. The engine stayed off. The radio stayed silent. I just sat there staring through the windshield while old memories moved through me like weather fronts rolling across dark water. People think revenge feels satisfying. Sharp. Victorious. But the truth is, when someone finally realizes how badly they failed you, the feeling isn't triumph. It's grief. Because part of you mourns all the years that understanding arrived too late to save. My phone buzzed around midnight. "Dad." I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered quietly, "What?" Long silence. Then his voice. "Can I come up?" I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm tired." "I know." Another silence. He exhaled shakily, "Please." 20 minutes later, he sat across from me inside my hotel room, holding untouched coffee from the lobby downstairs. No blazer now. No polished businessman confidence. Just a 73-year-old man suddenly forced to confront the possibility that he misunderstood his own daughter for most of her life. Rain tapped softly against the balcony windows while San Diego traffic hummed far below. Dad stared into his coffee cup. I keep replaying things. I leaned back quietly in the chair across from him. "What things?" All of it. His voice sounded rougher than normal tonight. Christmases? Family dinners? The way you used to leave early? He swallowed hard. I thought you were angry at us. I was. He nodded slowly. But now I think maybe you were hurting. That word nearly broke something inside me. Hurting. Not dramatic. Not unstable. Not difficult. Just hurting. I looked away toward the rain. You know what the worst part was? I asked quietly. Dad shook his head. I kept hoping somebody would notice. His face tightened instantly. Notice what? That I wasn't okay. The room fell silent again except for rain against glass. Finally, I continued. You remember Melissa's second wedding anniversary party? He nodded carefully. I disappeared halfway through because fireworks started outside. I stared down at my hands. I locked myself in your bathroom, shaking so hard I could barely breathe. Dad looked physically ill now. I thought you were being rude. I know. Another silence. Then he whispered something that sounded almost childlike in its regret. I didn't know. And for the first time in years, I actually believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Not cruelty. Blindness. My father grew up in a generation where emotional pain got hidden beneath work schedules, church attendance, and bourbon after dinner. Men his age survived by compartmentalizing everything, until eventually they lost the ability to recognize suffering unless blood was physically visible. He wasn't heartless, just emotionally uneducated. And unfortunately, that damage spreads through families like inherited debt. Dad rubbed both hands slowly across his face. When your mother died, he stopped briefly. I thought if I kept moving forward, the girls would too. I stayed quiet. She was the emotional center of everything. His voice cracked slightly now. After she was gone, I didn't know how to talk about feelings without feeling weak. That sounded exactly like him. Richard Hayes believed competence solved everything. Work harder. Stay composed. Keep functioning. But trauma doesn't negotiate with productivity. Eventually, it collects payment. Dad looked toward me again. So when you came home different every time? He shook his head slowly. I kept treating it like a behavior problem instead of pain. I swallowed carefully. You compared me to Melissa constantly. His face twisted immediately. I know. She got married, had kids, stayed close to home. I laughed softly without humor. Meanwhile, I couldn't survive grocery stores some days. Dad looked down. You scared me. That answer surprised me. What? You disappeared into places nobody could talk about. Then you'd come home colder every year. He rubbed trembling fingers together. I thought if I pushed you harder, maybe you'd snap out of it somehow. That hurt because it sounded painfully believable. Older generations often mistake pressure for motivation. Especially fathers. I wasn't lazy, Dad. I know that now. The rain outside thickened briefly. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Then he asked quietly, how bad did it get? I stared toward the dark hotel window. There are questions veterans usually avoid answering honestly because civilians don't know where to place the truth afterward. But tonight felt different. So I answered. There were months I didn't want to wake up anymore. Dad inhaled sharply. I'm not saying I wanted to die, I clarified softly. I just got tired of carrying everything. His eyes filled immediately. You went through that alone? Yes. Why didn't you call me? The sadness in his voice almost undid me completely. Because underneath all the damage, part of me had wanted exactly that for years. A father. Not a critic. Not a judge. Just a father. I didn't think you'd understand. He nodded slowly, like accepting a sentence handed down in court. You were probably right. That honesty mattered. More than defense would have. Dad stood suddenly and walked toward the balcony window, hands shoved deep into his pockets. I used to brag about other people's children constantly, he admitted quietly. Doctors, lawyers, military officers. He shook his head bitterly. Meanwhile, my own daughter was surviving things I couldn't even imagine. I watched his shoulders rise and fall slowly. When Admiral Walker looked at you, Dad paused. I realized he knew parts of you I never bothered learning. Neither of us moved. Then finally he turned toward me again. I'm sorry, Caroline. Not polished. Not rehearsed? Just broken. I'm sorry I made home feel like another battlefield. Emotion closed hard around my throat. Because that was exactly what it had felt like. For years. A place where I constantly defended myself instead of resting. Dad stepped closer slowly. I can't undo what I missed. His voice trembled openly now, but if there's still time, I'd like to know my daughter before one of us dies. That sentence hit with the quiet force only older people truly understand. Because after 60, 70, 80, time stops feeling theoretical. I stood slowly. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I hugged him. Not because everything was healed. Not because pain disappeared overnight. But because for the first time in my adult life, my father finally saw me clearly. And maybe that was the beginning of forgiveness. 6 months later, my father drove 8 hours just to help me replace a broken porch railing. That may not sound important to some people. But if you knew Richard Hayes, you'd understand it was practically a declaration of love. No speeches. No dramatic apologies. Just an old man arriving in North Carolina at 7 in the morning with a toolbox black coffee and too many hardware store supplies. That's how men from his generation often say the things they never learned to express out loud. By showing up. The little rental house I'd moved into sat near Wilmington, tucked beneath old oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Quiet neighborhood, mostly retirees, military families, and widows who waved from porches every evening around sunset. Peaceful. For the first time in years, peaceful. Healing didn't happen quickly after California. Honestly, some days it barely felt like healing at all. More like learning how to carry memory without letting it crush me completely. I started volunteering 3 mornings a week at a veterans transition center near the Cape Fear River. Mostly older veterans. Vietnam, Desert Storm, a few Iraq and Afghanistan men younger than me but somehow looking older around the eyes. Turns out trauma ages people unevenly. One Marine in his 70s used to sit alone every Thursday drinking terrible vending machine coffee without speaking to anyone. After almost 2 months, he finally looked at me one morning and said, "You move like military." That was the entire conversation. But the next week he sat beside me voluntarily. That's how trust works with damaged people sometimes. Quietly. Slowly. No grand breakthrough moments. Just consistency. Dad noticed the changes in me before I did. "You laugh more now," he said that afternoon while tightening bolts into the new porch railing. I leaned against the doorway holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "Do I?" "Yeah." He smiled faintly without looking up. "Used to feel like you were bracing for impact all the time." That sentence stopped me cold because it was true. For years, my nervous system lived like an alarm nobody could switch off. Even during calm moments, part of me always waited for disaster. Dad wiped sweat from his forehead and stepped back to inspect the railing. "Hand me the wrench." I passed it over silently. Watching him work felt strangely emotional now. When I was little, Dad fixed everything himself. Broken sinks, bike chains, fence posts. After Mom died, repairs became his coping mechanism. If he could keep the house functioning, maybe the family wouldn't collapse too. Unfortunately, people aren't plumbing. Pain leaks anyway. That evening, we grilled hamburgers on the tiny back patio while cicadas buzzed through humid Carolina air. Boats moved slowly through the waterway beyond the trees, their lights glowing soft gold at dusk. Simple life. The kind I used to think I no longer deserved. Dad sat quietly after dinner, staring out toward the water. "You know," he said, "eventually I've been thinking about something. That's dangerous." He chuckled softly. "I spent years believing strength meant hiding weakness. I stayed quiet. Probably got it from my father." He shook his head slightly. "Hell, that whole generation came home from wars emotionally half dead and nobody talked about it." That was true. Men from World War II and Korea often survived through silence because society gave them no other tools. Unfortunately, silence becomes inheritance. Dad looked toward me carefully. "When you came home struggling?" He paused. "I thought acknowledging it would somehow make you weaker." I swallowed slowly. Instead, pretending nothing was wrong made everything worse. Yes. The honesty between us still felt unfamiliar sometimes. Not uncomfortable anymore. Just new. Dad leaned back in his chair. "I actually started reading about PTSD. That surprised me enough to laugh." You. I know, shocking. What did you learn? He looked down at his hands. That a lot of traumatized people isolate because they're trying to protect others from themselves. Emotion tightened quietly in my chest. Because that was exactly what I'd done for years. Not avoiding family out of hatred. Out of fear. Fear of snapping at people, fear of ruining holidays, fear of bringing darkness into rooms that felt safe before I entered them. Dad exhaled slowly. I wish I'd understood earlier. Part of growing older is realizing regret never fully disappears. You just learn to live beside it more gently. A week later, Melissa visited with her 2 kids. Watching my sister move around my little house barefoot while her children chased fireflies across the yard healed something inside me I hadn't even realized was broken. For years I kept distance because I believed I no longer fit inside ordinary family life. Now I understood something different. Trauma may change people, but it doesn't disqualify them from love. Late that night after the kids fell asleep, Melissa and I sat on the porch swing listening to frogs near the water. I used to envy you, she admitted quietly. I blinked. You envied me. You got to escape. That stunned me. Melissa smiled sadly into the darkness. Dad put all his expectations onto me after you left. She tucked a blanket tighter around her shoulders. Perfect marriage, perfect kids, perfect life. Her voice softened. I spent years terrified of disappointing him too. That hit hard because I'd never seen her burden clearly either. Families misunderstand each other in every direction sometimes. I'm sorry, I whispered. She shook her head gently. We were both trying to survive him in different ways. The porch swing creaked softly while warm southern air moved through the trees. Then Melissa looked at me carefully. You know what changed him most. What? The shame. I frowned slightly. She continued quietly. Not because you were impressive, because he realized you were suffering and he missed it completely. I stared out into the darkness beyond the yard. Maybe that was true. Maybe the deepest pain parents feel isn't failure itself, but realizing they misunderstood their own child while there was still time to do better. The next morning, Dad prepared to drive back to Virginia. Before leaving, he hesitated beside his truck awkwardly. Then he reached into the cab and handed me something. An old framed photograph. Mom standing between Melissa and me at Virginia Beach when we were children. I stared at it silently. You should have it, he said softly. Emotion rose unexpectedly in my throat. Thank you. Dad nodded once. Then after a small pause, he added quietly, I'm proud of the woman you became, Caroline. His eyes filled slightly, not because of Syria, because you survived it, and still chose kindness afterward. That one nearly broke me. Because after everything, kindness was the part I fought hardest to keep. He hugged me tightly before climbing into the truck. I stood in the driveway watching him disappear down the quiet Carolina road beneath giant oak trees. And for the first time in decades, home no longer felt like a place I had to survive. It finally felt like somewhere I belonged again. If this story touched you, maybe take a moment to think about someone in your own life who might be carrying pain silently. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones struggling hardest behind closed doors. And sometimes one honest conversation can heal wounds that pride protected for years. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for spending this time with me. Drag her out. The judge's voice cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. The gavel slammed. Every head turned toward me. The bailiff took a step forward. Across the room, my father smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an uncertain smile. A victorious one. The kind of smile a man wears when he believes he has finally won after spending 30 years trying. I sat perfectly still. The courtroom in Billings, Montana had gone quiet enough for me to hear the old ceiling fan turning above us. The bailiff reached for my arm. I looked past him and directly at the judge. Does the name Raven 12 mean anything to you? The color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the bailiff. Not my father. Not even the court reporter. The judge stared at me as if he'd seen a ghost. Oh my God. His voice was barely a whisper. You are... A sudden crash echoed through the room. My father had collapsed. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I was 58 years old that day, and for the first time in my life my father was afraid. But to understand how we got there, you have to understand the kind of man Frank Whitaker was. To the town of Red Creek, Montana, my father was a respected citizen. Successful rancher, church deacon, Little League sponsor, Veterans Day parade organizer. The kind of man people described as solid. The kind of man who shook hands firmly and remembered birthdays. The kind of man who could charm a room in 5 minutes. People loved him. I used to wish I could. Growing up, I spent years trying. Nothing worked. My younger brother Tommy was everything my father wanted. Athletic, outgoing, interested in ranching. Tommy could make one decent tackle during a football game, and Dad would talk about it for weeks. I got straight A's. Dad barely noticed. Tommy bought his first pickup. Dad framed the photo. I earned a scholarship. Dad asked if I was finally done showing off. Those things stay with a child, even when that child becomes an adult. Even when that adult spends decades pretending otherwise. My mother Evelyn was different. She saw everything. She never challenged Dad directly. Back then, most women in our community didn't. But she found quiet ways to let me know I mattered. A note in my lunchbox. A phone call after an exam. A hug when Dad wasn't looking. She was the bridge between us. When she died 6 years ago, the bridge disappeared. And whatever little relationship remained between my father and me disappeared with it. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 5 years before the lawsuit arrived. At the time, I was living in Norfolk, Virginia. My life was simple. I owned a small house. I volunteered at the local veterans center. I spent mornings walking near the water and afternoons reading. After years working for the Navy, quiet felt like a gift. Then the certified letter arrived. I remember standing at my kitchen counter opening it. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. Then I read it again. And again. My father was suing me. Not just suing me. Trying to strip me of my ownership rights to the Whitaker Ranch. The ranch had been in our family for generations. When my mother died, I learned something that shocked everyone. She had left me a legal share. Not Tommy. Not Dad. Me. The decision had enraged my father. At the time, I didn't fight. I simply held the deed and moved on. For years, nothing happened. Then suddenly, 6 years later, Dad decided he wanted everything. His lawyers claimed I had abandoned the property. Claimed I had no interest in maintaining it. Claimed I didn't deserve ownership. The lawsuit wasn't about land. I knew that immediately. The acreage was just an excuse. Dad wanted one final victory. One final chance to prove I didn't belong. When I arrived back in Montana, the old town looked exactly the same. The diner still served cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates. The church bell still rang every Sunday morning. The mountains still stood silently against the horizon. Only I had changed. Age does that. You stop trying to win battles that don't matter. Unfortunately, this one did. Because it wasn't really about me. It was about my mother. The share she left behind was her final statement. Her final act of love. A way of saying, you belong here too. I wasn't going to let my father erase that. The first day in court confirmed my suspicions. The judge and Dad greeted each other by first name. They laughed together before proceedings started. I watched from my seat. Dad didn't even try to hide it. He was comfortable, relaxed, certain. The entire hearing felt predetermined. Every objection from my attorney was dismissed. Every argument from Dad's side was accepted. Hour after hour. The outcome became obvious. Even the spectators seemed to know. By lunch recess, Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in decades. He actually winked at Tommy, like a man celebrating an early victory. That afternoon, things got worse. The judge ruled against nearly every motion we filed. Then he accused me of withholding information that didn't exist. When my attorney protested, he threatened sanctions. I could see where it was heading. The final humiliation. Public removal from the courtroom. Exactly the kind of ending my father would enjoy. And then came the moment. The order. Drag her out. The bailiff stepped forward. My father smiled. I looked at the judge and asked a simple question. Does the name Raven 12 mean anything to you? Everything changed. The judge turned pale. The bailiff froze. My father's smile vanished. And as he collapsed onto the courtroom floor, one thought crossed my mind. For the first time in 30 years, Dad was finally about to learn who his daughter really was. The last thing my father saw before he hit the floor was the expression on the judge's face. I know because I saw it too. For 30 years, Frank Whitaker had believed he understood everything. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who was successful? Who was a disappointment? And most of all, who his daughter was. The moment I said the words Raven 12, that certainty shattered. The courtroom exploded into confusion. People stood up. Chairs scraped against the floor. Someone yelled for a medic. Tommy rushed toward our father. The bailiff abandoned me and moved to assist. But none of that was what caught my attention. I was watching Judge Harold Benson. His hands were trembling. Not slightly, visibly. The same man who had spent all morning treating me like an inconvenience suddenly looked as though he'd seen something impossible. For several seconds he simply stared at me. Then he leaned forward. "Clear the courtroom." Nobody moved. I said, "Clear the courtroom." This time everyone listened. The spectators filed out. The attorneys gathered their files. Even the court reporter looked confused. Within minutes the room was nearly empty. My attorney Susan Keller turned toward me. "What the hell just happened?" I gave her a small smile. "Good question." The truth was I wasn't entirely sure myself. I had expected recognition. I had not expected panic. Susan lowered her voice. "Sarah, who is Raven 12, I looked toward the window overlooking downtown Billings." "It's a long story." She waited. I didn't continue. Eventually, she sighed. "You're impossible." That's what my mother used to say. That earned a brief smile. Then the courtroom doors opened again. A paramedic stepped inside. "Mr. Whitaker's stable." Nobody responded. The paramedic looked around awkwardly before leaving. Judge Benson remained seated behind the bench. His eyes never left me. Finally, he spoke. "Miss Whitaker." "I prefer Ms. Whitaker." He nodded. "Ms. Whitaker." Silence filled the room. Then he asked the question everyone wanted answered. "How do you know that designation?" I almost laughed. Designation. Not name, not nickname. Designation. That single word told me everything. He knew exactly what Raven 12 was, or at least enough to be frightened by it. "I'm guessing you know," I replied. His jaw tightened. The judge looked toward my attorney. "Ms. Keller, court is adjourned until Monday." "Monday?" she asked. "That's 4 days away." "Monday." His tone left no room for discussion. The hearing ended. Just like that. No ruling. No decision. No explanation. After everything that had happened, we were simply sent home. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already begun gathering. Small-town reporters, mostly. People from local papers and radio stations. They surrounded Tommy the moment he emerged. My brother looked exhausted. "Is your father okay? Will the case continue?" "What happened in there?" Tommy ignored them. For once in his life, he genuinely looked lost. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. As Susan and I walked toward the parking lot, a voice called out behind me. "Ma'am." I turned. An older man stood near the courthouse entrance. Late 70s. Gray hair. Weathered face. Federal Marshal retirement pin on his jacket. Something about him felt familiar. He studied me carefully. Then his eyes widened. "I'll be damned." I recognized him a second later. "Marshal Grayson." He laughed softly. "Thought that was you." Susan looked between us. "You two know each other?" The old marshal shook his head. "Not exactly." Then he looked at me. "Been a long time." "Yes, sir." The respect in my voice was genuine. Years ago, our paths had crossed briefly during a federal operation. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth discussing, but apparently he remembered. More importantly, Tommy heard everything. My brother had stopped halfway across the parking lot. He was staring. Confused. Concerned. For perhaps the first time in his life, he realized there might be entire chapters of my story he knew nothing about. I wished him luck. There were many. That evening, I drove back to the small motel where I was staying. The same motel I'd used during previous visits. The owner, Martha Jenkins, had known me since high school. She handed me my room key. "Heard about court. News traveled fast in Montana." I smiled. "I'm sure you did." She leaned across the counter. "Your father still stubborn?" I laughed. "Some things never change. Neither do daughters." Her words stayed with me. Upstairs, I sat beside the window overlooking the highway. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. For a while, I simply watched traffic pass. It reminded me of evenings years ago aboard Navy installations. Long days, quiet nights. Time to think. People often assume military service is full of excitement. Most of it isn't. Most of it is paperwork, waiting, sacrifice, distance. The real cost comes later, when you realize entire decades passed while you were somewhere else. My father never understood that. As far as he was concerned, I had abandoned Montana. Abandoned family. Abandoned responsibility. He never asked what I had actually been doing. Never asked where I'd gone. Never asked why. Perhaps because he didn't really want the answer. The next morning proved something had changed. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. "Susan, you need to hear this." I sat up straighter. "What happened?" I just got off the phone with one of Frank's attorneys. That surprised me. And apparently your father hired a private investigator last night. I wasn't shocked. That sounded exactly like him. What did the investigator find? Susan laughed. Not happily. Nervously. Nothing. What do you mean? I mean he quit. I frowned. Quit? He refunded the money. Now that got my attention. Why? Susan hesitated. He wouldn't say. That afternoon, however, we got our answer. A friend of Susan's worked in town. By pure coincidence, she'd spoken with the investigator. The man had been visibly shaken. According to her, he'd spent 12 hours trying to research my background. Military records, government records, employment history, everything. Then he abruptly stopped. When Frank demanded an explanation, the investigator said only one thing. One sentence. Nothing more. Nothing less. I can't help you, Frank. Then he hung up. And from what I later learned, my father stared at that silent phone for a very long time. Because for the first time in his life, Frank Whitaker had encountered something he couldn't control. And it terrified him. By Friday morning, the story had spread across 3 counties. Not because anyone knew what Raven 12 meant. Nobody did. The story spread because people had seen Judge Harold Benson's reaction. In a small Montana town, that was enough. Judges weren't supposed to get rattled, especially not Benson. For 20 years, he'd built a reputation as the calmest man in the room. The fact that he had practically ended the hearing after hearing 2 words from me became the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. The local diner buzzed with theories. The feed store buzzed with theories. The barbershop buzzed with theories. Most of them were ridiculous. I was supposedly a former CIA operative, a witness in a federal mob case, a Pentagon official, a fugitive, an undercover marshal. One theory even suggested I had secretly worked at Area 51. That one made me laugh. The truth was both less exciting and more complicated. But nobody was getting the truth from me. Not yet. I spent Friday afternoon driving out to the ranch. Not because I wanted a confrontation. Quite the opposite. I wanted to see the place my mother loved. The gravel road hadn't changed. Neither had the cottonwood trees lining the entrance. As my truck rolled toward the property, memories surfaced one after another. Summer mornings feeding horses. Winter evenings around the fireplace, my mother humming while she baked pies. For a moment, I wasn't 58. I was 12, and Mom was still alive. The ranch house came into view. A familiar ache settled in my chest. Some places carry memories so deeply that time barely touches them. This was one of those places. I parked near the old red barn. The paint had faded. The roof needed work. Still, it felt like home, or at least the closest thing I had left. I walked toward the fence line where my mother used to sit in the evenings. She'd bring coffee. I'd bring a book. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes we wouldn't. Both seemed equally important. Standing there, I suddenly remembered the day she told me she'd changed her will. It had been 15 years earlier. We were sitting beneath the big cottonwood near the creek. I remember protesting immediately. Mom, Dad's going to lose his mind. She laughed. He usually does. I'm serious. So am I. I can still hear her voice. Soft. Steady. Certain. Sarah, this isn't about money. Then what's it about? She looked toward the pasture. It's about belonging. At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now I did. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew there would come a day when she wasn't around to remind me I mattered. The land was her way of doing it anyway. Around sunset, I heard another vehicle approaching. I didn't need to look. I knew who it was. Tommy. My younger brother parked 20 yards away and climbed out. He looked older than I remembered. The years had not been especially kind to either of us. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. You could have called. I smiled faintly. You could have answered. That ended the conversation before it began. Tommy shoved his hands into his pockets. Dad's upset. I looked at him. That's your opening argument. It's the truth. So is gravity. He sighed. The same sigh he'd been using since childhood whenever I became difficult. Or perhaps whenever I refused to surrender. I don't understand why you're doing this. I laughed. That genuinely surprised me. Doing what? Fighting. I stared at him. Then I stared a little longer, because I suddenly realized he meant it. He honestly didn't understand. You think I'm fighting, aren't you? No, Tommy. I shook my head slowly. Your father sued me. The words hit him harder than I expected. Not because they were new, because they were true. For years, Tommy had acted as though every family conflict somehow involved equal blame. as though fairness required splitting responsibility down the middle. Some situations don't work that way. Sometimes one person creates the problem. Sometimes another person simply refuses to disappear. He looked away. Dad says you abandoned the family. There it was. The old accusation. The one I'd heard for decades. I took a slow breath. Then I asked a simple question. When Mom got sick, who paid for her experimental treatment? Tommy frowned. What? Answer the question. Dad did. No. His eyes narrowed. I continued. When the drought nearly cost the ranch 12 years ago, who covered the property taxes? Silence. Who paid for Uncle Robert's surgery? More silence. Tommy stared at me. A strange expression crossed his face. Confusion. I reached into my purse, pulled out a folded envelope, handed it to him. Inside were copies of bank records, checks, transfers, receipts, years' worth, quiet contributions, anonymous assistance, emergency payments, thousands and thousands of dollars, all linked to me. Tommy's face slowly changed. He turned pages, then more pages, then more. Finally, he looked up. You did all this? Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? I almost laughed, because the answer seemed obvious. Mom knew. His throat tightened. That's it. That was enough. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorted softly. Finally, Tommy sat down on the fence rail. He looked exhausted, like a man discovering he had misunderstood an entire story. I didn't know. I know. His voice dropped. Dad didn't know either. That earned a sad smile. Tommy. What? He never wanted to know. The difference mattered. A lot. Later that evening, after Tommy left, my phone rang. Susan. Her voice sounded unusually serious. We have a development. I leaned against the porch railing. What kind of development? A lawyer arrived from Washington this afternoon. I frowned. Washington State. No. She paused. Washington, D.C. Now I was interested. What does he want? Nobody knows. Who does he represent? Another pause. That's the strange part. What? Apparently he isn't representing anyone. I looked toward the darkening horizon. Then why is he here? Susan's answer sent a chill through me. According to the hotel clerk, he came to observe Monday's hearing. The line went silent, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I had a feeling Monday was going to be very different. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of Montana morning that makes people pull their jackets tighter and drive a little slower. I woke before sunrise, not because I was nervous, because old habits die hard. Years of military service had trained my body to wake before the alarm. I made coffee in the motel room and sat by the window. The parking lot below was empty. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. Then my phone rang. Susan. Ready? As I'll ever be. She laughed softly. That's not reassuring. I wasn't trying to reassure you. Fair enough. Before hanging up, she added something that caught my attention. The lawyer from Washington is here. Already. He arrived before 7. That was unusual. People don't fly across the country to attend small-town property disputes. Not unless something else is happening. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stared out the window for a long time. Because deep down I knew exactly what was happening. The problem wasn't Raven 12. The problem was recognition. There are moments in life when a single word reaches the wrong ears. And suddenly people start remembering things they'd rather forget. The courthouse looked different that morning. Busier. Tenser. People gathered outside before the doors even opened. Reporters had doubled since Thursday. The local radio station was broadcasting from the sidewalk. Everyone wanted answers. Nobody had any. As I walked toward the entrance, conversations stopped. People stared. I wasn't famous. I wasn't important. But I had become the center of a mystery. And people love mysteries. Inside the courthouse, security seemed tighter than before. Even the deputies looked uncomfortable. One of them recognized me. His expression immediately changed. Not fear. Respect. The kind that comes from hearing rumors you don't fully understand. I nodded politely and continued inside. When I entered the courtroom, my father was already there. So was Tommy. Neither looked rested. Frank Whitaker looked 10 years older than he had 4 days earlier. His collapse hadn't been a heart attack. The doctors later called it a stress-induced episode. His body had simply reached its limit. For years, he had controlled every room he entered, every conversation, every relationship. Then suddenly he found himself facing something he couldn't understand. It was eating him alive. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. That alone told me everything. My father had never looked away before. Not once. A few minutes later, Judge Benson entered. The entire room stood, then sat. The difference was immediate. Thursday's judge had been confident, relaxed, almost arrogant. Monday's judge looked like a man carrying a burden. He shuffled papers unnecessarily, adjusted his glasses repeatedly, avoided eye contact. The courtroom noticed. So did my father. And that worried him more than anything else, because Dad had spent his entire life reading people. He knew fear when he saw it. The hearing began. For several minutes, nobody mentioned Raven 12. Instead, we discussed property boundaries, inheritance law, tax records, routine legal matters. But everyone knew we were simply circling the real issue. Eventually, Judge Benson stopped speaking. He looked directly at me, then at my attorney, then back at me. Finally, he asked, "Ms. Whitaker," his voice sounded careful, very careful, "would you be willing to clarify your statement from Thursday?" The room became silent. I folded my hands. "What statement?" "You know which one." I did, but I wanted him to say it. The judge hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Raven 12. Across the room, my father visibly tensed. Tommy leaned forward. The reporters began scribbling notes. I took a slow breath, then answered honestly, "Probably not." The judge frowned. "Probably. Most of it isn't mine to discuss." That was true. And everyone could hear it. The difference between refusing and being unable. The judge understood immediately. So did the man from Washington. I noticed him for the first time sitting near the back row. Mid-60s. Expensive suit. Federal posture. Watching everything. Saying nothing. The hearing paused for recess shortly before noon. As people filtered into the hallway, something unexpected happened. Judge Benson approached me privately. Not as a judge, as a man. For several seconds, he simply stood there. Then he spoke. "I haven't heard that designation in almost 30 years. I studied him carefully. "Neither have I." His expression darkened. "I was a federal prosecutor back then." There it was. Finally. A piece of the puzzle. The judge continued. "There was an operation." I said nothing. He nodded. "Most records disappeared." "Yes. Most people involved disappeared too." "Also true." The judge swallowed hard. His voice lowered. "Some of us believed everyone connected to it was gone. Now I understood his reaction. Not fear. Shock. The same kind of shock you'd feel if someone walked into a room after being presumed dead for decades. The problem was that nobody had actually thought I was dead. What disappeared wasn't the people. It was the story. The records. The names. The memories. The entire operation had quietly faded into history. Exactly as intended. The judge looked exhausted. Why bring it up now? For the first time I smiled sadly. Because my father spent 30 years pretending I was nobody. Judge Benson glanced toward the courtroom. Toward Frank Whitaker. Then back at me. And suddenly he understood. This was never about classified programs. Never about government secrets. Never about national security. It was about a daughter. A daughter whose own father never cared enough to ask where she had been. When recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The atmosphere had changed. The mystery remained, but the focus was shifting. People were beginning to realize the story wasn't Raven 12. The story was Frank Whitaker, and the daughter he never bothered to know. The hearing resumed. My attorney presented evidence. Financial records, property documents, historical ownership records. Then she introduced something new. A collection of payments, medical bills, emergency expenses, tax records, all linked to me, all connected to helping the family over the years. The courtroom grew quiet. Tommy looked stunned. Again, my father looked worse. Each document felt like another brick removed from the wall he'd built around himself. The wall that said I didn't care, that I had abandoned everyone, that I owed nothing, and received nothing. The truth was far less convenient. For years I had helped quietly, without credit, without acknowledgement, without expectation, because my mother would have wanted it that way. When Susan finished, silence filled the room. My father stared at the documents, then at me. For the first time in decades, he looked confused. Not angry, not defensive. Confused. Like a man discovering he had been reading the wrong map his entire life. Then suddenly his hand moved to his chest. Tommy noticed first. "Dad!" Frank didn't answer. His face had gone pale. The courtroom erupted into motion, and as doctors rushed toward him, I realized something important. My father wasn't collapsing because of Raven 12. He was collapsing because the truth finally weighed more than the lies. The second collapse happened in complete silence. One moment my father was sitting at the plaintiff's table. The next he was gripping his chest. His face had gone gray. Not pale. Gray. The kind of color that instantly makes everyone in the room understand something is wrong. "Dad," Tommy was already moving. The judge stood. The bailiff called for medical assistance. People rushed forward. For a few seconds, nobody cared about lawsuits, property rights, or courtroom procedure. They cared about a 79-year-old man struggling to breathe. I remained seated, not because I didn't care, because I couldn't move. I was watching the strongest man from my childhood suddenly look fragile, and no matter how complicated our history had become, that was difficult to see. Very difficult. The paramedics arrived within minutes. They stabilized him and transported him to St. Vincent Regional Hospital. The hearing ended immediately. No objections, no arguments, no complaints, just silence. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it actually was. Susan offered to come. I declined. This wasn't a legal matter anymore. It was family. And family has a way of becoming complicated when nobody is billing by the hour. By the time I arrived, Tommy was sitting alone in the waiting room. His elbows rested on his knees. His hands were clasped together. He looked exhausted. When he saw me, he didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Finally, he shook his head. "I don't understand any of this." I sat beside him. "I know." "No, I mean it." He looked genuinely defeated. "Everything I thought I knew keeps turning out wrong." I stared at the floor tiles. For once, I had no clever response, because I understood exactly how he felt. Sometimes the hardest thing in life isn't learning new information. It's realizing old information was never true. A doctor eventually appeared. Middle-aged. Calm. Professional. "He'll be fine." Tommy exhaled so hard it almost sounded painful. The doctor continued. "Stress played a major role." I almost laughed at that. If stress could be measured like rainfall, my father had spent decades standing in a hurricane. The doctor left. Tommy remained silent. Then he looked at me. "Will you see him?" The question surprised me. A week earlier, I would have answered no, without hesitation, without guilt. Now I wasn't sure. Eventually, I nodded. "Yes." My father looked smaller in a hospital bed. It's strange how illness can do that. The same man who once seemed larger than life now appeared ordinary. Just another elderly patient attached to monitors. Just another man growing old. When I entered the room, he was awake. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other, neither knowing where to begin. Finally, he spoke. "You're still here." His voice sounded weak. I pulled a chair closer. "Apparently." A faint smile appeared, then disappeared. The room became quiet again. Outside, I could hear distant hospital activity. Nurses walking, phones ringing, life continuing. Eventually, my father cleared his throat. "Tommy told me about the money." I said nothing. He showed me the records. Still nothing. My father looked toward the window. "You paid for your mother's treatment." "Yes." "You helped the ranch." "Yes." "More than once." "Yes." The answers came easily. The silence afterward didn't, because neither of us knew what to do with the truth. Finally, he asked the question that mattered. "Why?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the age lines. The gray hair. The exhaustion. And suddenly I saw something I'd never noticed before. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of regret. I loved Mom. My answer was simple. It mattered to her. His eyes closed. For a moment I thought he might cry. Instead he nodded, slowly, as though absorbing something painful. Then he asked another question. The one everyone had wanted answered. "Were you some kind of spy?" Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in days. My father looked offended. "What?" I shook my head. "That's what you're worried about. People keep talking. It's a small town. That isn't an answer." "No." He waited. I waited. Eventually he sighed. "So what were you—" The room grew quiet. I could have told him about assignments. Operations. Classifications. Years spent serving in places he never knew existed. I could have explained Raven 12. At least the parts I was allowed to explain. But suddenly none of it seemed important. Not anymore. So I gave him the only answer that mattered. "I was your daughter." The words landed harder than any secret ever could. I watched them hit him. Watched understanding slowly replace confusion. For years my father had focused on what I did. Where I went. What title I held. What records existed. What records didn't. And in doing so, he missed something obvious. The person standing in front of him. His daughter. Nothing else should have mattered. Yet somehow everything else had. His eyes filled with tears. The sight stunned me. Frank Whitaker didn't cry. At least not when I was growing up. I never saw it happen. Not once. Now tears sat openly in his eyes, and he made no attempt to hide them. I failed you. The words were barely audible. I looked away. Not because I disagreed. Because hearing them hurt more than I expected. The child inside me had waited decades for that apology. Now that it finally arrived, I wasn't sure what to do with it. My father continued. I kept thinking you'd come back and become who I wanted. I stared at the floor. When that didn't happen, his voice cracked. I got angry. Neither of us spoke. The monitors quietly beeped beside the bed. Finally, he whispered something that changed everything. I treated you like an enemy. The honesty caught me off guard. Because it was true. Painfully true. For years, every success I'd achieved somehow offended him. Every accomplishment became evidence I was leaving. Every choice became a rejection. Not because I hated him. Because I was becoming myself. The realization seemed to hit him all at once. His shoulders sagged. Years of stubborn pride finally collapsing. Then came the question. The hardest one. Can you forgive me? The room felt very still. I thought about childhood. About my mother. About years of silence. About all the things we'd lost. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It doesn't happen instantly. Not real forgiveness. Real forgiveness takes time. Patience. Honesty. Sometimes more than one conversation. So I didn't lie. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. I didn't give him the ending he wanted. Instead, I reached over and adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulder. The same way my mother used to. Then I stood. And before leaving the room, I quietly said, I came to the hospital, didn't I? For the first time all day, my father smiled. Not a victorious smile. Not a proud smile. Just a hopeful one. And somehow that felt like a beginning. 3 months later, I stood on the front porch of the Whitaker Ranch and watched the sun rise over the Montana hills. The morning air carried the scent of grass and distant rain. A herd of cattle moved slowly across the eastern pasture. Nothing seemed different. And yet everything was, the lawsuit was over. Not because somebody won. Because eventually nobody wanted to keep fighting. After my father's hospitalization, something shifted. Not immediately. People like Frank Whitaker don't change overnight. Neither do daughters who spent decades protecting themselves, but little things began happening. Conversations. Questions. Moments. The kinds of moments families usually have years earlier. We were having them at 79 and 58. Late was still better than never. The legal resolution surprised almost everyone. Including my attorneys, the evidence had become overwhelming. The ranch records were clear. My mother's will was clear. The financial records were clear. If the case continued, I would almost certainly win. Completely. My father knew it. His attorneys knew it. The judge knew it. So 1 week after leaving the hospital, my father called. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. But it changed everything. I want to settle. I stood in my Virginia kitchen holding the phone. What kind of settlement? A long silence followed. Then he answered. The honest kind. For once there were no conditions. No tricks. No hidden demands. No attempts to control the outcome. Just honesty. It felt strange. Almost unfamiliar. The final agreement gave me exactly what my mother intended. My legal share remained intact. No reduction. No compromise. No surrender. After 30 years, I had finally stopped letting my father decide my value. That alone felt like victory. But then came a second decision. One nobody expected. Including my father. Including Tommy. Including me. Because after the paperwork was completed, I spent several nights thinking about what came next. The easy option would have been selling. Many people advised it. Take the money. Walk away. Close the chapter. Move on. A younger version of me might have done exactly that. But age changes your perspective. You begin measuring success differently. At 25, I